That's exactly what my contract states. Clean up, pack up, leave behind a single dime sealed in an envelope. 30 years, 3 decades of dedication. The company I had poured my life into owed me this meager pension. Yet Steven Tyler, the current young, smug, second-generation heir, mocked me as if my years of hard work meant nothing. His words didn't just sting. They left me feeling hollow, disheartened. Any connection I once had to this company was gone. This wasn't the same company I had joined right out of high school. It had transformed into something unrecognizable, a corporation that no longer valued loyalty. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply nodded, took the exit packet he handed me, and replied, "Understood." Then I walked straight to the systems management room. There, with a few keystrokes, I erased everything from the company's internal management system. You might think that was cruel, but it was outlined in my contract. Part of my official responsibilities upon leaving. I was only following orders. Seconds later, chaos erupted. "Hey, I can't send emails. What's going on?" someone shouted. "I can't access the internal system either," another voice joined in. Panic spread like wildfire. Then Steven himself stormed toward me, pale and visibly shaken. "What's happening here? Are you okay?" he demanded, his voice trembling. I turned to face him, my expression calm. That moment, that was the true beginning of my long-standing tension with the company's second-generation president. My name is Stephen William, and I'm 50 years old. I spent my entire career, almost my entire life, working for this company. I joined right after high school, making me the longest-serving employee here. In an era where job hopping is common, my loyalty made me an anomaly. My job as manager of systems management had always been challenging, but I found it fulfilling. Over the years, my younger colleagues became more skilled, which meant I had less hands-on work. Life felt good, and I was proud of what I had built. One of my most capable juniors, Samuel, approached me one day, looking concerned. "Mr. William, I think there's a mistake here, but I'm not sure what's causing it," he said, pointing to his screen. I glanced over his shoulder. "Oh, this code isn't right. Here's how it should be," I explained, fixing the issue in seconds. Samuel beamed at me. "Thank you, Mr. William. I don't know what we'd do without you." I smiled. "Soon enough, you'll be the one in charge of all this. I'm counting on you." Samuel laughed nervously. "I'm not ready for that yet." "What are you talking about?" I asked. "I'll be 50 soon. I've been thinking about how I'll spend my retirement." Samuel shook his head. "You've still got over a decade left, Mr. William. Why are you even talking about retiring?" Being in his 30s, he didn't yet understand how quickly time flies. Still, I assured him, I plan to keep working hard until the day I leave. There's a lot I still want to accomplish before then. Back then, I felt satisfied with my life and career. But everything changed suddenly. It started when Ethan Tyler, the company's founder and president, fell ill and was hospitalized. His condition worsened unexpectedly, leaving no hope for recovery. In his absence, his only son, Stephen, swiftly took over as president. Stephen wasted no time delivering an emotional inaugural speech. "This situation has shocked us all, but it's time to unite and move forward together. We'll bring about the changes this company needs to thrive." His enthusiasm was contagious. At first, his words lifted everyone's spirits. I had known Stephen briefly during his time at a subsidiary company, and I truly believed he could carry on his father's legacy. But my optimism didn't last. Shortly after taking over, Stephen focused solely on efficiency and cost-cutting. His sweeping changes included sudden reorganizations, staff layoffs, and transfers that threw the entire office into chaos. But the worst part? How he treated the company's most experienced, long-serving employees. Instead of valuing their years of expertise, he saw them as obstacles to younger workers' growth. Rather than firing them outright, he humiliated them. He demoted them to lower positions with significant pay cuts. Skilled salespeople were reassigned to desk jobs, while support staff were placed in roles they weren't trained for. Those who struggled in these positions eventually quit out of frustration. Meanwhile, younger employees were promoted at lightning speed, often without the necessary skills or experience to justify it. At first, I tried to make sense of it. If the younger employees were truly talented, I could understand. But their performance reviews said otherwise. The company's most talented young workers, disillusioned by favoritism, they left. Those who remained? They were Stephen's loyalists, people rewarded for obedience, not competence. One by one, my trusted colleagues resigned. People I had worked with for decades were leaving. My team, my department, my work family, everything I had built was falling apart. He was one of our top salespeople, someone who had consistently boosted the company's revenue. As he packed up his things, he gave me a faint smile. "Thank you for everything, Stephen." I forced a smile, trying to keep my emotions in check. "But why are you leaving? You're so good at what you do." He let out a heavy sigh. "I'm just tired of giving my all to this place. It doesn't feel worth it anymore." Then he looked at me and added, "But Stephen, you're the backbone of this company. No one else can manage the systems like you do. Hang in there." As he grinned, probably trying to lighten the mood, I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I tried to smile back, but my heart ached. I should have been waving him off with a cheerful farewell, but instead, I just watched him leave, his back disappearing into the distance. How many times had I seen colleagues, friends, walk away like this? You'd think a mass exodus like this would spark a rebellion, but nothing ever happened. One by one, talented employees left, leaving behind only those who were overworked, resigned to their fates, or loyal to President Stephen. I was one of the determined ones, still clinging to the company I had once loved. But it was clear the company was on a downward spiral. The signs of decline were everywhere. Even President Stephen seemed uneasy. "This is just a temporary setback," I overheard him telling his supporters one day. "It's like crouching before a big leap forward. We'll bounce back soon." I couldn't believe the arrogance in his words, especially when those around him blindly echoed, "As expected from the president." It was obvious. He wasn't willing to admit his mistakes. Frustrated, I returned to the systems management room where Samuel was waiting for me. "Mr. William, there's big news," he said excitedly. "The president is coming to inspect the systems management room today." I frowned. "What?" "Yeah, after all the personnel changes, he's looking to cut costs in our department. He might even target the systems themselves." I sighed, trying to hide my unease. "There's not much we can do, Samuel. President Stephen has a habit of making cuts in critical areas. It's good that he's enthusiastic, but his priorities are all wrong." Not long after, President Stephen arrived. His eyes scanned the room, as if he were trying to figure out what we actually did here. "Isn't the air conditioning too high?" he asked suddenly. "Heating and cooling costs are significant, you know." I answered calmly. "Computers are sensitive to heat, so this temperature is necessary for management purposes." He gave a half-hearted nod, clearly uninterested in my explanation. Ignoring me, he turned his attention to Samuel and started asking him questions, completely overlooking the fact that I was the department manager. After wandering around the room for a while, he finally turned to me. "Stephen, right?" I was surprised he even remembered my name. "Yes, Mr. President." "How long have you been working here?" 30 years. 30 years, he repeated, his tone overly casual, almost dismissive. It grated on me, but I kept my composure. Then came the real reason for his visit. "I noticed your base salary is rather high. Was that part of your original employment terms?" I held my ground. "Yes, it was." "Well, Samuel here is managing the system now too, isn't he?" "Technically, yes," I admitted. But something about his wording unsettled me. This was my first one-on-one conversation with the president, and despite my reservations, I decided to offer some advice. "Mr. President, I strongly recommend not replacing the current system. With all the recent personnel changes, many employees are still adjusting to their new roles. Switching systems now would only reduce efficiency further." President Stephen raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. Before I could explain further, he cut me off. "That's for me to decide." His sudden harshness caught me off guard. I had never seen him look at someone like that before, cold and condescending. Then his expression shifted into a smirk. A worker like you, challenging the president's decisions? His voice was sharp, mocking. You need to remember your place. I clenched my fists, biting back my frustration. I'm sorry. His smirk widened. You're the manager, right, Stephen? Don't worry. I'll think about this thoroughly, just like I do with the system. His sarcasm was clear. Then without another word, he walked out. As soon as the door closed behind him, Samuel let out a deep sigh of relief. That was intense, Mr. William. You're incredible. I shook my head. I'm sorry, Samuel. I didn't mean to create such an awkward situation. No, it's okay, he said quickly. Honestly, your viewpoint makes a lot of sense, but the president, he's incredibly frustrating. What's going through his mind? Samuel muttered. I scoffed. Probably nothing good. Samuel and I sat quietly for a moment, both deep in thought. After that day, we decided to have an honest conversation about our future. Considering the company's current state, it seemed like the best course of action. A month later, I was summoned to the president's office. When I arrived, President Stephen greeted me with a forced smile. Stephen, thank you for all your hard work over the years, he began. I nodded politely, unsure where this was going. Then he dropped the bombshell. We've decided to let you go. I stared at him in disbelief. What did you just say? It's not personal, he said with a grin. It's strictly business. He handed me a small packet. This is your pension. The envelope he gave me looked cheap, and something about it felt wrong. Why wasn't the payment done via a bank transfer? Still in shock, I opened it. Inside was a single coin, a dime. I clenched my fists. Mr. President, this isn't funny, not even as a joke. Oh, it's no joke, he replied coolly. He pulled out a document and placed it on the desk in front of me. Take a look at this. I recognized the paper immediately. It was my employment contract, the same one I had signed 30 years ago when I first joined the company. Stephen tapped a specific section with his finger. Look here, he said smugly. Your employer pension is listed as 10 cents. My eyes widened in shock. Next to the section about the employer pension, which originally just stated pension provided, someone had scribbled in 10 cents with a ballpoint pen. The handwriting was unmistakably different from the printed text. Stephen grinned triumphantly, tracing over the handwritten words. See, I didn't write this. It was already there. Amusing, isn't it? But you signed and stamped this contract, didn't you? I opened my mouth to object, but he cut me off before I could speak. This is all by the book, he said firmly. Clean up and leave, just as stated in the contract. His expression made it clear. Any argument was pointless. At that moment, I realized something. I had probably been on his radar for a while. I was the kind of long-serving employee he wanted to push out, someone who represented the old guard he despised. The only reason I hadn't been targeted earlier was my control over the company's systems. But after his last visit to the system management room, he must have decided that Samuel was capable enough to take over. My honest advice during that visit had likely rubbed him the wrong way. What a petty, narrow-minded man. A company led by someone like him? It had no future. As I left his office, I thought of all my colleagues who had been forced out before me. Their frustration, their sadness. It all made sense now. I forced a smile. Understood. Then I walked out, stuffing the flimsy envelope into my pocket. My next stop was the system management room. Samuel was waiting for me just as we had planned. It's time, I said calmly. Samuel nodded, his face serious. I'm ready. We sat down at our computers and got to work. Dismantling a system is much easier than building one, and we had everything erased in no time. Soon, the office erupted into chaos. Through the walls, I could hear panicked voices. Hey, I can't send emails. The internal system isn't working. What's happening? The confusion spread quickly. I cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. Employees were running around, lost, unable to figure out what to do. It wasn't long before President Stephen stormed in, pale and frantic. "Stephen!" he yelled, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. "What did you do?" I turned to face him, calm and composed. "I did exactly what you asked, Mr. President." His eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "You told me to clean up my personal belongings before leaving." "Why did you delete the system?" he shouted. I shrugged. "Well, since the system belonged to me, I removed it. I was just tidying up what I had contributed to the company." Stephen's face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out the same contract he had been so eager to show me earlier. "It's all here," I said, pointing to a specific clause. This system wasn't company property. My salary over the years had covered its loan, and the agreement was that I would return it when I left. "You should have this document on file," I added smoothly. "It's been part of the records for 30 years. Stephen stared at the contract, clearly flustered. "What is this nonsense?" he snapped. "It's ridiculous that one employee leaving can bring down the entire system." I resisted the urge to fire back about how equally ridiculous it was to offer a pension worth a single dime. Instead, I kept my voice steady. "If you cancel my dismissal, I'll return both the system and your dime." Stephen's face turned red with rage. He slammed the contract onto the desk. "Samuel, restore the system immediately!" he barked. Samuel hesitated, but quickly nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll get started right away. But it will take time." "I don't care how long it takes, just do it!" Stephen shouted, his voice echoing through the room. As Samuel began the restoration process, I stood there quietly for a moment. Then, exchanging a glance with him, I decided it was time to leave. I walked out of the system management room, the place I had spent so many years of my life, my mind buzzing with determination. This wasn't over. A few days later, I was at home, relaxing. When my phone rang, I glanced at the screen and saw the company's main number. I answered, and the first thing I heard was President Stephen's voice. Except this time, he sounded nothing like the arrogant man who had dismissed me. "Stephen," he said, his tone exhausted. "We're in trouble." I leaned back, already suppressing a laugh. "Oh?" "Samuel is struggling to restore the system, and nothing is working. We've already lost days of productivity, including the weekend." His desperation was almost tangible, a far cry from the smugness he had displayed in his office. "So what do you want me to do about it?" I asked, feigning indifference. There was a pause before he blurted out, "Sell us the system. I'll pay you $200,000. That was it? I actually laughed. "President, you have no idea what that system is worth, do you? That's nothing." "What do you mean, nothing? Then how much do you want?" $1 million, I said bluntly. $1 million? His voice cracked, and I could practically picture the stunned look on his face. "Yes, $1 million. And even at that price, you're getting a bargain. That system is worth far more." "This is outrageous," he snapped. I smirked. "More outrageous than offering me a pension of 10 cents? Realizing he wasn't taking me seriously, I dropped my playful tone. "Listen carefully, President Stephen. If you don't pay $1 million, you won't get the system back. And I won't help Samuel restore it either." There was a long silence on the other end. When he finally spoke again, his voice was cold. "Enough. I won't give in to your ridiculous demands. How dare you ask for such an outrageous sum, you ungrateful man!" Then he hung up. I set the phone down, feeling a mix of disappointment and resolve. It was clear now. This man was unfit to lead. Without hesitation, I picked up the phone again, ready to move forward with the next phase of my plan. The next day, loud shouting erupted from the president's office. The furious voice belonged to Stephen, now the former president, slamming his fist on his desk. "Why am I being fired?" he demanded, his voice shaking with outrage. Across from him stood Ethan Tyler, his father, looking far more imposing than his frail condition suggested. Though Ethan hadn't fully recovered from his illness, his presence was commanding. Watching him from the doorway, I couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration. "I'm not firing you," Ethan said sternly. "I'm demoting you to a regular employee. You need to start over and learn from the ground up." Stephen's face turned red. "Me? A former president working as an ordinary employee? How humiliating!" Ethan slammed his hand on the desk, making Stephen flinch. "Humiliating?" Ethan bellowed. "You should be ashamed of the chaos you've caused. You nearly destroyed this company." I stood silently as Ethan unleashed his frustration. "I was a fool to believe your reports," he continued. "I warned you not to interfere with personnel decisions, yet you forced out so many trusted people, including Stephen." At the mention of my name, Stephen turned to glare at me. He knew I had played a role in his downfall. He wasn't wrong. His reckless decisions had become intolerable, and I had taken steps to bring everything to Ethan's attention. Feeling guilty for disturbing Ethan during his recovery, I had sent him a detailed report about what had been happening under Stephen's leadership. Ethan, who had trusted his son's updates without question, was shocked when he read my account. Realizing the company was on the brink of collapse, he decided to return to the office, despite still needing treatment. I still remembered his words to me when he first arrived. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Stephen. My foolish son would have destroyed the company I built." In that moment, I knew I had done the right thing. Samuel and I had carefully planned our actions. We knew that if things continued as they were, I would eventually be forced out too. So, we made the management system unusable, putting pressure on Stephen and his most loyal yet incompetent supporters. The chaos that followed the system shutdown was immense. Stephen couldn't handle the situation, and even his staunchest supporters began to lose faith in him. For the first time, the hard-working employees spoke up. "Resign. Bring back President Ethan." The protests grew louder until Stephen was brought before the board. The criticism was harsh, but justified. The board called out his poor treatment of long-serving employees, his mismanagement of layoffs, and the disaster caused by the system failure. Then, the topic of my system came up. One board member spoke up. "If we can purchase that system permanently for $1 million, it's a bargain. Why didn't the president buy it?" Another added, "Rebuilding from scratch would cost far more in both time and money." Hearing their appreciation for my work filled me with pride. All those years I had spent developing and maintaining the system had not been in vain. After the board's decision, Stephen was officially demoted. Back in the president's office, he sat across from Ethan, his head hung low. "I'm sorry," he said reluctantly. His apology was stiff, the dissatisfaction still visible in his expression. I kept my response simple. "Yeah." Ethan, watching the exchange, turned to me. When Ethan looked at me, his expression softened. "Stephen, I'm truly sorry for all the trouble. Will you consider coming back to the company?" His sincerity touched me. For years, this company had been my home, and seeing it in such a state had been heartbreaking. But with Ethan back in charge, there was hope. I smiled. "Yes, I'll come back, as long as you're the one leading." "Thank you," Ethan said, relief evident in his voice. Then, as if remembering something, he asked, "Should we go ahead and pay the $1 million for the system?" "That won't be necessary," I replied. "You've already given me so much over the years." Ethan laughed, and I couldn't help but join in. From the corner of the room, Stephen sat quietly, watching us with a puzzled expression. Later, back in the system management room, Samuel looked at me with admiration. "I'm glad everything worked out, Mr. William. I was so nervous about how it would all turn out." "You went through a lot too, Samuel," I said. "You even had to work over the weekend because of all this." Samuel shook his head with a smile. "If it means making the company a better place, I'd give up my weekends anytime. Besides, all I really did was pretend I couldn't fix the system." I chuckled. "Your acting was perfect. It was the key to resolving everything." Samuel nodded thoughtfully before scoffing. "Stephen was terrible, though, offering you a 10-cent pension and even faking the contract. That's just unbelievable." I hesitated for a moment before saying, "Actually, there's something you should know. That handwritten 10 cents in the contract, I wrote it myself." Samuel's eyes widened. "What? What do you mean?" I smiled, sensing his curiosity. Let me tell you a story. A story about my younger self and how I ended up here. It's something I've never shared with anyone before. Back in middle and high school, I had been a loner. I couldn't fit in, and I struggled to communicate with others. Most of my time was spent alone in my room, tinkering with my computer. It became my world, my escape. I developed original source codes and built systems from scratch, lost in my own universe. One day, Ethan Tyler, a friend of my father's, heard about my work. He recognized my talent and offered me a job as a systems manager at his company. For someone like me, who had spent years shut away from the world, his belief in my abilities meant everything. Not only did he value my work, but he also offered me a salary far above what a high school graduate could typically expect. Ethan's faith in me gave me a chance to step into the world. And for that, I would always be grateful. I still remember the day he offered me that unusually high salary. Even as a young man, I knew the amount he proposed was far more than I deserved. I can't accept this much, I told him honestly. But Ethan simply shook his head. This is still a modest offer, he replied. Our company is just getting started, and this is all we can afford right now. But as the company grows, we'll make sure to give you raises. Your system is that valuable. His words left me stunned. In a moment of impulsiveness and youthful innocence, I took the contract he handed me and scribbled something with a ballpoint pen. I wrote 10 cents next to the employer pension section. Ethan's eyes widened when he saw what I had done. 10 cents? He asked, surprised. Yes, I said earnestly. I already feel bad accepting such a high salary every month. I don't want to take any extra money when I leave. This is my idea of fairness. Though he must have found my reasoning amusing, Ethan simply gave a gentle smile. Let's think of it this way, he said. We'll consider this system as a loan to the company. I'll include that in your work contract and prepare a formal document for it later. When you leave, you're free to take the system back. But if we need it, we'll buy it from you. Wouldn't that act as the employer pension? I nodded, realizing how clever the arrangement was. You noticed that right away, didn't you? Ethan chuckled warmly. You're remarkably sharp. His laughter put me at ease, and in that moment, I decided that I would follow Ethan's lead no matter what. He had seen something in me when I was at my lowest, and his faith pulled me out of my shell. When I finished recounting this story to Samuel, he let out a deep breath. So that's what happened between you and President Ethan, he said, his voice filled with awe. Yeah, I replied. But I never imagined that contract would resurface because of Stephen. As for Stephen, he didn't last long at the company after his demotion. Unable to bear the humiliation of working as a regular employee, he resigned and started a business with a friend. However, Ethan later told me that Stephen's venture was struggling financially and didn't seem to be going well. Even after recovering and returning to full-time leadership, Ethan faced countless challenges. I could only hope Stephen wouldn't disrupt his father's work any further. I need to let him learn the hard way, Ethan said firmly one day. It's like a lion throwing its cub into the valley to teach it how to survive. I doubted Stephen would ever ask for help, even if he needed it. He had chosen to quit on his own and was too proud to admit defeat. With Ethan back in charge, the company slowly regained its energy and focus. Samuel and I worked tirelessly to develop a new system that was more efficient and user-friendly. Things were finally starting to feel right again. One day, I received unexpected news during a visit to Ethan's office. What do you want me to do? I asked him, curious about the purpose of the meeting. Ethan leaned back in his chair and smiled. I want you to work as an executive, he said simply. I froze. An executive? Yes, he said, his tone serious yet kind. You're my right-hand man now. Eventually, I'd like you to become the executive vice president. I hope you'll agree to work alongside me as we rebuild this company. The weight of his words hit me hard. Executive vice president. The title itself carried immense responsibility. It meant overseeing the entire organization and standing as Ethan's closest advisor. Do you really think I'm suited for a role like this? I asked hesitantly. Ethan's gaze softened, as it always did when he sensed my doubts. The next generation is ready, aren't they? He said, referring to Samuel and the younger employees we had been mentoring. I nodded. Yes, I'm confident Samuel can handle it. There's no issue there. Then let's get started, Ethan said with a smile. We need to prepare for the shareholders' meeting and finalize your executive appointment contract. His use of the word contract made us both chuckle. Make sure you don't write 10 cents on this one, he teased. I laughed. Oh, don't worry, I won't. The warmth in the room was palpable, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a deep sense of hope and belonging. As I left the president's office, a thought struck me. Could I, as an executive, help bring back some of my colleagues who had left in despair? The idea filled me with determination. I was grateful I had fought to defend this company. Even when the odds were stacked against me, this company had given me a chance to step out of my isolated world and find happiness under the open sky. It had become more than just a workplace. It was a place that connected people, past, present, and future. As I walked back to my office, I felt the cool breeze of a new beginning. For the first time, I was moving forward, ready to embrace what lay ahead.